On this episode of China Unscripted, the U.S. has failed at stopping the Chinese Communist Party spread, and the rest of the world is suffering. But India has a solution that could be the key to defeating the CCP. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
And joining us once again is Cleo Paskal, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks for joining us, Cleo. How are those democracies doing?
You know, they're having a bit of a rough time. It's a midlife crisis for some, but I think they're going to get through it.
That's good. That's good. I mean, if you're in a foundation for defense of democracies, aren't you financially motivated to make sure democracies are never truly secure?
Yes, that's exactly right. I go around trying to undermine democracies so that we have a consistent stream of income. But, you know, I'm failing. I'm not very good at my job, luckily.
It's always about money. Wow. Everyone loves that intro I just did. So Xi Jinping, he's had some kind of strange behavior lately. So there was that meeting he dodged during the BRICS summit, and there was no explanation for why. And then he was a no-show for the G20. What do you think's going on with him? Something up?
There are a lot of rumors, including that his position is quite weak. I think that there are probably different reasons for each thing. But for me, we talk a lot about peak China, and so you get this argument that the economy is crashing or the population is declining and China's reached its peak. It may very well be, but my concern is whether it's peak amount of damage China can do to everybody else, and I don't think we're anywhere near that peak. So I don't get too much involved in trying to read the tea leaves of what's going on with the political leadership, but rather see what's happening with the behavior in the region towards other countries. Is it suddenly following international law? Has it suddenly made it easier for the Philippines to resupply their own men on their own territory? Has it stopped antagonizing people by issuing maps that claim half of the world belongs to China? That doesn't really seem to be the case. So until that starts to happen, I'm not going to be concerned about inside politics, particularly.
Well, I do read the tea leaves, and they tell me that the Chinese Communist Party will collapse in 42 days, 7 hours, 36 seconds. That's what they say. Got it.
I fully expect to see like a YouTube comment under this video being like, it's now 46 days, 7 hours, and 27 seconds. You were wrong.
Yeah, I'm not going to make it the title this time. But so you said you haven't seen the limit to...
If I may, just to completely derail things, if there is some sort of a collapse at the top, what do you think that looks like?
That's a good question. There would be a power vacuum, and then everyone would be trying to step into that faction. I guess it would depend on what happens to Xi Jinping. Is it a case where Xi Jinping himself is assassinated? There's plenty of people there's the old head of the Jiang faction, Zheng Qinghong, who's still alive. He might put himself into a position of power or have somebody tied to him or his old clique back in power. It also depends on where the fall happens. Is it because there is a popular uprising in the people where they say, no more Chinese Communist Party? Then it would be very interesting to see who comes into power, because I think anyone who was tied to the party would, no longer be in a position to be in power. So then where would a future leader of China come from? I'd like to think Gao Zhisheng, but he might not be alive anymore. But yeah, it's an interesting question. It depends on how it actually happens. I don't know, maybe BlackRock could take over. Matt, Shelley, I don't know if you had ideas.
Your answer was so good, Chris. I have nothing further to add.
I'm sorry I can't hear you over your mustache.
I'm mustache mesmerized as well. So question. So there are two national level organizations which are heavily interlinked. There's the Chinese Communist Party and there's the PLA. which of course at the top are kind of fused. But, if there is a collapse in the CCP, would the PLA say, we're going to come in and restore order? I mean, this is, again, this question of what next, this peak, have we reached peak authoritarianism in China even?
Oh, there's always another mountain summit to climb. But no, I think that's a good question. I think this is one of the reasons why this is a strong argument against China launching some kind of war in the near term. Because for Xi Jinping, that would mean he'd have to appoint somebody to be in control of the joint military forces. And then that person would become the most powerful man in China and have the ability to stage a military coup against Xi Jinping. So I think he would be very reluctant to put somebody in that position. I mean, he can symbolically have himself in that position, but when it comes to actually issuing orders and controlling troops, it would need to be somebody who knows what they're doing.
I think China will face a challenge if it's politically unstable at the top, because you can increase the amount of authoritarianism, but what will happen at the same time is that it'll be either more chaotic in society or substantially less productive. Because you kind of need a lot of tight control to maintain this, what's currently a very, very high level of authoritarianism and surveillance. And so, like, if you try to increase that, then you might just do kind of what's already happened over the last couple of years with the zero COVID controls. You control more and more, but then you also weaken from the bottom. Like, you're weakening the economy, you're killing the small businesses.
Well, and on that point, one of the issues Xi Jinping is facing is sort of this high-level paralysis in the government. Nobody wants to do anything because they're afraid of getting purged in some kind of anti-corruption campaign. So there is a serious issue of just people in positions of power not doing anything because they don't know what the right thing to do is. And if that voice at the top that is supposed to be commanding things disappears, could be pretty rough.
I definitely don't think China's reached peak authoritarianism because even though there's greater and greater technological control, I think over the since the 90s, essentially, there was a loosening of party control at the kind of grassroots level where, when my parents were in China living, working, everybody worked for the state. Like, everything was controlled through work units, including your housing, right? You couldn't rent an apartment. You couldn't buy a home. Like, everything was given to you by the state. And that stopped being the case when they did all the economic reforms in the 90s. And so even though the party is still very much in control at the top level, once you got down to the, provincial, city, county levels, then there was a lot of looking the other way in order to let, private businesses thrive. There's also a lot of corruption and looking at the way so that, officials could make money. So I think now that Xi Jinping is becoming more and more paranoid and seems to be convinced that, the CCP's power needs to be consolidated, not just at the top, but in increasing lower levels of government, that there needs to be more and more control over private industry, that there needs to be a reversion to kind of these state-owned companies being the leader of the economy again. I don't see that we're anywhere near peak authoritarianism. We might just reach a point where it's kind of like the technological control that we have now married to the social and political control that the CCP had even at the grassroots level in the 70s and 80s, and that would truly be a nightmare.
How much of the just day-to-day purchasing is done electronically now by the average Chinese?
You mean in using Alipay or WeChat Pay versus cash? In cities, in the top tier cities, I believe it's close to 100%. Because the Communist Party has made a huge push to get people off of cash. And that, of course, is for many reasons, but one is the mechanism of control. They can see all the transactions easily. I believe that cash is still used in different parts of the country, though. Like, probably in more rural areas. You know that 2012 film Looper, right? And then like they're in the future in China and he's got like these big stacks of like Mao money. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's actually really wrong because in the future there's not going to be cash. And China is definitely spearheading the push towards a cashless society. And for them, I believe it's primarily about control and surveillance.
Right. So it does not look great then domestically or internationally, regardless of whether we've got Xi in power or not. Speaking of, if I may insert a slight related thing, I am a Canadian, and I have been a member of Air Canada since the 1860s. I've been getting frequent flyer points since we were using horse-drawn carriages. And in order to be able to use my points now, I just got a message from Air Canada saying that they want access to all of my credit card data and web browsing related to the Air Canada group without saying who's in the Air Canada group, and to be able to use it in all sorts of ways that are not being specified. So I think Air Canada has been taking some lessons from the CCP and really refining the system. So, and in fact, Canada in many ways, I think, has been taking some lessons from the CCP.
I was about to say that. Yeah, Trudeau especially.
And shout out to Tarelich and Chris Barber, who are currently on trial. They were the two leaders of the truckers' protest, who are, this is not really being covered, but are currently in the middle of a trial in Ottawa for mischief charges and some other things. They've served time in jail. They have extremely high costs, and nobody's really talking about it. So we just did.
They're being charged with mischief? Is this Harry Potter?
Yeah. Mischief, some kind of very relatively minor things. And there's been some quite interesting testimony about whether bouncy castles are a threat or not.
I'm a firm believer that bouncy castles are a symbol of white supremacy.
Right, because you bounce higher and higher, you get, if you're white. Yeah, I get it. Anyway, it's in some cases it's been just about that absurd, but there you go. Next.
Interesting. Maybe we'll cover that on America Uncovered. But something you said that you're concerned that China hasn't reached the peak of the damage it can do to other countries. Now I'm curious what you mean by that, because considering that China is facing all of the economic hardships, you'd think China would want to be going to BRICS, going to the G20 to have a chance to ease international tensions, maybe get some foreign investment flowing back into China. So where are these two things going? Like, it seems like they'd want to be doing good things, trying to get everyone back on their side, but you're saying they might actually start damaging other countries more.
Yeah, I mean, this is this spiral that communist, dictatorial, and regimes get themselves into. They can't not do it. It's like what you're saying about economically, domestically, their model is based on coercion, and so if you withdraw that coercion, the economic model. So this is something an Indian analyst told me at least 15 years ago. The idea that China's suddenly going to democratize because of economic development makes no sense, because its economic model depends on authoritarianism. Similarly, its external engagement is fundamentally parasitic. The goal is to suck out capital and intellectual property and effectively power through the comprehensive national power kind of framing of the way of living things, which weakens the target country and enriches the host, or strengthens the host. At least that's the idea. But the problem is that eventually you end up weakening the target so much there's no or little sustenance to be sucked out from it. I mean, the amount that China can make off a strong American economy is much less than it can make off a weakened American economy. But its goal is quite overtly to become number one in the world in terms of comprehensive national power, and that means weakening its competitors.
I find that very terrifying because the U.S. economy has never been stronger under Biden economics.
It's Bidenomics, Chris.
Bidenomics?
So I'm a huge fan of your.
No one's quite sure where to go with this.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so where we can go with this is to take one small sliver of that entire topic, which is fentanyl, and take a look at what that has definitely done to the U.S. society and economy, and why hasn't that stopped? Because it's benefited China. I mean, the precursors are coming out of China. We know it. I mean, there was an agreement. I think Xi stood with Trump and said he was going to do something about it, which implies that he could do something about it, and nothing was ever really done about it because it benefits them. And it's a very good example of how it seems like it's clever, might seem like it's clever to a certain mindset to just weaken the opposition and benefit off of it in the process. But in the end, you're weakening everybody. Now, this gets back to the G20, which I think was a question from about an hour and a half ago, which is India has shown a different kind of approach, which is where they had the motto was kind of sort of one planet, one family, one future. Sort of just a kind of a very, very inclusive sort of thing. And it's not glib. This idea of one family, which has been the world is one family, which has been one of the foreign policy mottos of Prime Minister Modi, sounds very fluffy and touchy-feely and whatnot. But, family is hard. You have cousins you'd prefer not to deal with, siblings who steal your stuff, parents who you might feel are too pushy, kids who don't listen to you. Family is hard, and in that context, family. That image of family, a realistic view of what family is a turning on its head of the old kind of U.S. dictum of there's no friends, there's only interests or whatever, and saying that unless you have a relationship that is family-like, you can't weather these ups and downs as well. You can't go through difficult systems unless you invest the social capital that's required in something like a family sort of relationship. You're actually much weaker individually and, of course, as a group. And so India's vision is of foreign policy, and which was on display at the G20, where, for example, they insisted and did manage to get the African Union to be a full member, to get a seat at the table. European Union was. Now African Union is, thanks to lobbying from India, and they argue that makes everybody stronger. So you're starting to see develop this very different approach to the benefit of a healthy relationship with healthy friends or healthy allies. And of course, if you look at China, the Chinese Communist Party deliberately destroyed the family, right? Through the one-child policy, it destroyed the family. So that fundamental aspect of humanity, which allows you to understand and want to spread this concept of building a global family, and not in a kind of fluffy, touchy-feely way, but in a really kind of practical social spreading of social capital to increase your chances of survivability in times of crises way, doesn't exist in China anymore. It was deliberately killed by the state. So that's what became very clear at the G20, that there was this other model that was being proposed by India that is not as fuzzy as it seems, and actually may be much more viable in the long run, especially for medium-sized countries or smaller countries that have just been buffeted by this a very different approach by what have been the greater powers recently.
How do you think this message was received at the G20?
Extremely well. I mean, that's why you saw, I mean, who knows what will actually come out of it? Because again, China, in the context of comprehensive national power, any success by Indian leadership, even if it's a deliberately distributed leadership, is a threat to China. So there will be attempts to sabotage it all the way along. But you saw things come out of it, like just two examples. The proposal for the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which bypasses both China and Russia geographically and is presented as a competitor to the Belt and Road, even though it's very different than the Belt and Road. It can create kind of linkages through economics and physical infrastructure that can tie the future of those countries together. It makes all of the countries involved in the in this competitor to the BRI want it to succeed. Whereas in the case of the BRI, it's usually just China and elements within the target country that want it to succeed. So it's this kind of a distributed power model. Another example is, and a big problem the U.S. Navy has is ship repair. I mean, it's a real problem. A lot of U.S. capacity has been shut down, and Captain Fennell has spoken about this very eloquently and passionately. We've seen cases where a ship or a submarine breaks down, around the South China Sea, and it has to go all the way back to Hawaii or to California for repair. One of the agreements that was made on the sidelines of the G20 was to build up Indian capacity to do U.S. Navy, specifically mentioned U.S. Navy repair, and possibly expand that in aviation and other areas as well. If we're going to start to see more competition or conflict in the Indian Ocean part of the Indo-Pacific, that's going to become quite critical. So this, there's going to be possibly some ship repair facilities in the U.S. who won't like it, who thinks everybody should come back to the U.S. to be fixed up. But in this world as one family or distributed responsibility to increase everybody's resilience model, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, this is interesting because with these internal hardships that China is facing, how do you think that's going to impact the global ambitions, especially as the world is waking up to the threat of the Chinese Communist Party?
This is I don't know because I don't know what Xi's motivations are, but I also don't know. There's this kind of fantasy that if you get rid of an authoritarian, they'll be replaced by somebody lovely, right? If you get rid of Putin and even
that's what happened with Russia.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I don't.
Putin is
don't.
handsome.
Yeah, but he doesn't have a mustache.
As far as world leaders go, that's true.
I don't, who knows whether, if Xi tries to retain power by trying to attack Taiwan, or if somebody comes in and says, because Xi hasn't taken Taiwan, I'll take Taiwan and I'll replace Xi, or if somebody comes in and says, we can't afford any of this, but what we should do is, degrade India's capability through persistent cyber attack, we'll do that. Like, I don't know. China has, through unrestricted warfare, has given itself so many tools in its toolkit, and it has so many targets that, from middle America with fentanyl to shutting down the Mumbai electrical grid to throwing chaff at Canadian Air Force planes to it has so many options. It's hard to tell what direction it would go in.
So you think as things get worse, China more likely will act out and otherwise to attack other countries?
I don't know. I mean, it's easier to see that pathway than to see a pathway where they shift towards cooperation. Like if you try to imagine what would have to happen for the Chinese Communist Party to want to play nice over the long term, there may be short-term concessions with the idea that as soon as we're strong enough, we're going to, get back to business as usual. But I don't, given the way it was set up, and this is what we're talking about in terms of the internal giving itself the levers for increased authoritarianism internally, and the amount of money and effort that has gone into building up this military capability. I mean, the ships coming off the line are out of control. This isn't rhetorical. I actually just don't see a pathway where, they become a responsible member of the global community that upholds international law and stops expanding and doesn't, and lets the Philippines do what the Philippines needs to do and stops threatening the Chinese and doesn't do joint operations with the Russians and backs off of the pressure on its, financial engagements in the U.S. Like, I don't. Do you guys see how that could happen?
Well, I guess this is the whole flaw of the engagement school of China, that you basically see the Chinese Communist Party as basically being the same as us, and everyone's out for mutual self-interest. And if you work together, obviously we'll work together in our best interest. And that makes a lot of sense if you're a rational person, but that's not how communist systems work. For example, and we'll put this up on screen, but while the G20 was going on, China came out with that new Standard Map 2023. And, rather than working more closely together with other countries, they now have this 10-dash line. They took a bunch of Indian territory, even Russian territory. So it seems like, if anything, they're only becoming more aggressive.
It's almost as if what people from the engagement school, almost what they hope for, is more. It's not even that China will suddenly cooperate or the CCP will suddenly be like sunshine and rainbows, but that they'll just go back to doing it quietly so everybody can go back to ignoring it.
Well, that's pretty cynical, Shelley.
I mean, I don't think that anybody, even as kind of pro-engagement as you can be, can realistically look somebody and say with a straight face that they're hoping that, the CCP becomes, like a positive leader and blah, blah, blah. I think it's just they want them to de-escalate.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering whether that 10th dash is actually just a middle finger, like that, just a little kind of icing on the cake of the claim. It's
it is like salt in the wound.
Yeah.
The 10th dash, I believe, is they just added an extra one to the east of Taiwan just to make it super clear that Taiwan is part of China.
I have seen that 10th dash before. Maybe they're just standardizing it now.
I mean, it's called the Standard Map 2023, so I guess it is standard now.
So now everybody has to say 10-dash line.
But I don't think we have to, Shelley.
But it's the standard map, Matt.
You're going to anger China.
Oh, because they called it the standard map, so now we have to use their phrase.
Yeah.
You're right. Nope. You're right, Shelley.
The standard behavior of the CCP map. They actually released it just before the G20, and as soon as they released it, for some of us at least, it seemed pretty clear that Xi wasn't going to be coming to the G20. And when you think about it, it would have given, and it's again a really good indication of how there is this fundamental difference between the way India and China are operating. If he would have gone to the G20, he would have been playing second fiddle. I mean, they're kind of used to balancing the relationship with the U.S., but he would have been playing second fiddle to Prime Minister Modi, right? And that's just not a look that the Chinese Communist Party is comfortable with. So, this idea of, giving political space or strategic space or any space to anybody else is just not, I mean, it's not even playing to a domestic political audience, because they can control that to a large degree. It's just not in the way that they can function as individual human beings. Being the guest of Prime Minister Modi at an event where there are, world leaders, and everybody is paying attention to India and maybe not necessarily to Xi. Like, it's just, it's very hard to picture it. And it shows this kind of corner that China has painted itself into. And so its only response can be to make its corner bigger and bigger and bigger until its corner takes over the whole room. And, there are all sorts of countries that are saying they can't do it anymore. And this Philippines Transparency Initiative is really interesting. They've made this conscious decision of saying, we're going to show you what China is doing in our waters. We're going to show you the water cannons, the interceptions. We're going to show you this bad behavior. And I think if others, including the US, started to show more of that as well, it would be very helpful. This is, again, something Captain Fennell has advocated for years. Once you actually see what the people on the front lines of dealing with China see, you can understand that this behavior is entrenched, dangerous, and on a trajectory that you can't appease.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see that change that you're talking about with how the Philippines are treating China, because the kinds of dangerous maneuvers the Chinese Coast Guard has been performing against the Filipino fishermen or even their fleets, it's been going on a long time, but now the Philippines are just being very open about it.
It was interesting. I think Al Jazeera had a report where they were on one of the Filipino Coast Guard ships, and it seemed like there were a lot of media on this particular Coast Guard ships as they were trying to resupply the Filipino Marines on the island that the name escapes me right now. But essentially that they had all these international media there to film the Chinese Coast Guard almost ramming their ship.
Yeah, I was at a conference recently in Indonesia, and there were representatives from 30 different militaries around the Indo-Pacific, and the Philippine military people were being treated like rock stars by everybody else. Like, there are a lot of other militaries in other countries going, man, we really wish we could do what you were doing. This is great. And it's there are certain things that, as countries say, look, we can't wait around for somebody else to come and save us. We're going to need to do it ourselves. There are a lot of holes in the American umbrella at the moment, or whatever, architecture they had been relying on. You're starting to see this knitting together. And again, we saw it at the G20 of these other relationships and role models for each other that have the potential to change the game on the ground. And what we saw at the G20 was the U.S.-India relationship has been complicated, but in this context, the U.S. was very supportive of a lot of the initiatives that India was promoting, in part knowing that India can do things that the U.S. can't. India can build relationships that the U.S. can't. Now, India also has relationships that the U.S. would like it not to have, including the kind of long-term relationship with Russia, which is, very complicated. But instead of just at the G20, instead of just saying, stop your relationship with Russia, there was starting to be a kind of move towards, well, maybe we'll work with you on things like, building a jet engine domestically, more defense cooperation, and give you an alternative to that Russian collaboration, because that Russian-India defense collaboration was also producing things like the BrahMos missile, which could be sold into other countries in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think, DOD at least has certainly understood that, if India is going to be building more domestically in terms of defense, it would be better if it was collaborating with American companies and then selling into third countries rather than collaborating with Russia, and also build up an alternative supply chain for replacement parts for some of the Russian gear, and basically just look at a long-term weaning off of some of that. So this kind of understanding that sometimes your allies can take the lead. Philippines is definitely in the lead on dealing with, how to do the political warfare around the South China Sea. India is in the lead in terms of being able to engage economically with a lot of economies that are more similar to the Indian economy than they are to the U.S. economy. So this G20. It may be a flash in the pan, or it may be a coming out party for a shift, from any residual non-alignment to a realignment, a realignment around this more complex view of the world as one family. That's represented as far back as, if you go back to those Indian strategic texts, the Arthashastra, which is like this thick, versus Sun Tzu, which is this thick. It's a much more complex view of the world and how to create stability within it.
So how do you think this is going to affect a lot of these other countries that are suffering from Chinese influence, but are not necessarily standing up? I'm thinking, I know Biden recently on 9/11, he was in Vietnam trying to beef up relations between the U.S. and Vietnam against China, but also like all of the Pacific Island nations that I know we've talked a lot about that are struggling with really severe Chinese influence operations.
Yes. So I think he was in Alaska, if I'm not mistaken, but I think maybe he was in transit. But words are really important to understand what's going on the ground. And when you say that a country like Solomon Islands, has gone over to China, that it's usually, at least initially, just a very small group within the leadership. So China will come in, Chinese Communist Party, and in many cases, criminal organizations will come in and develop relationships with a very, very small number of leaders. Then that money then they become proxies who spread the money throughout the systems, and it kind of corrupts the systems from the inside. And you get a specific targeting of, and this goes back to the warfares of unrestricted warfare. Guermont Lailari has spoken very, very well about this, about targeting they'll, apart from everything else, they'll always go after the independent judiciary, the media, and the kind of psychology of governance. And the ultimate goal is to metastasize the Chinese system, which means the destruction of democracy and the replication of it. There's that parasite, to use the parasite model again, that gets into the host and then takes over its brain and then runs the host from the inside. And that's kind of the model. Now, what does that mean in the context of a place like Solomon Islands? Solomon Islands, the leadership of Solomon Islands has indeed signed the security deal with China. This is not popular on the ground. And if they had free and fair elections, it would change. That's why the Chinese proxies are going after the elections. That's why they have already delayed elections once. So these countries are not lost to China. I've heard it repeatedly said, "Oh, Solomons is lost to China." First of all, when a country recognizes Taiwan, it's not like Beijing says, "Oh, that country is lost to Taiwan." They stick around and continue to fight their corner. Similarly, if you want to give the people, if you truly believe in the world as one family, and you believe in the people, which we should as proponents of democracy, you bolster the elements within that country that are important to the people. And unfortunately, what's happened in Solomons is, that there's been a focus on what the leadership wants, which is very similar to the appeasement process that you see with China. So Australia has, for example, thrown in like 100 million Australian dollars towards the Pacific Games, which is going to be associated with China anyway. But I was in Solomons recently and went to the local hospital there. And if they had put 1/10 of that into the local hospital, Australia would be so much more popular on the ground in Solomons, and the idea of engagement with the West would be so much more popular with Solomon Islanders than with China. And then you ensure that there's democracy. If China shows up with the peace arc, which they did, they're the only ones providing us with healthcare. And you've rigged the elections anyway, and we're too weak and tired to fight. And if this is the way the country's going to go, that's what it's going to go. We don't have any options. So until you actually provide those options, you're leaving the playing field to China. I think my argument makes sense, but I could be unsure. Tell me what I've missed.
Well, so do you think with the U.S. and Australia, these Western powers failing, for example, the people of the Solomon Islands, do you think the actions of India and the Philippines could provide some kind of solace to them and empower a movement against Chinese communist incursion?
Yeah, there's so many countries that just want an option. They just want an option. And that's why, when Prime Minister Modi went to Papua New Guinea in May and proposed this, 12-point plan for the Pacific Islands, they were things like setting up a dialysis unit in every country. You'd think this is an area that has incredibly high diabetes rates. Why hasn't Australia helped with that already? Why are we at this point in history? But what India is offering, and this is another thing, is that we talk a lot about security cooperation, and again, there is a discussion now about whether Australia should help this pro-PRC Prime Minister of the Solomons, who landed in China recently and said it's good to be home. Whether he's now said he wants a military. So the discussion is whether Australia should help him build a military. Now, they're doing it under the rubric of security cooperation. Again, if you get back to kind of putting the family at the core of interactions, then you can expand the definition of security from that kind of hard security to human security. And what do you need for human security? You need a hospital. You need roads that work. You need affordable telecoms in case of emergency. So, accepting this kind of almost this Chinese definition of security, or very traditional definition of security, doesn't resonate locally, and actually doesn't really provide security, unless it provides, in fact, an opening for China, because they're going to out-securitize your security anyway, especially if you get these increasingly authoritarian leaders in. So on the human security front, if you change the terminology from security, just straightforward security, to human security, India is extremely good at it, because it's had to deal with so many of these issues in a similar climate at home. with flooding and erosion and remote villages and small scale economics and education, in remote areas, small classrooms, all that sort of stuff. So the model that India is proposing, and I'm sure there are models from others. I'm sure there are lessons to be learned from the Philippines and the Pacific Islands, or from any number of countries. So seeing that kind of interaction, or Africa. I mean, this is why it's great. The African Union is now in the G20. Might start to create more of this sort of human security that ideally would bolster democracy, which makes it a very unappetizing or more difficult host for the parasitic Chinese Communist Party.
Sounds like India would be a much better steward of the region than Australia.
I don't know what to tell you. There are a lot of really good Australians who understand everything that I'm saying, and who've served on the ground, and who've sacrificed, and who are trying to make things better. But this is all the political parties in China, in Australia, Freudian slip there, seem to have fallen into this trap of looking at the Pacific as basically politically inconvenient if independent. And so they were colonists in the area until quite recently, until the 70s. And the idea of independent countries is complicated, and they've overtly said in for example, the I think it was 2017 white paper, that the goal is to integrate the Pacific Islands economically and in terms of security with Australia. They'd like everybody to use the Australian dollar and to be, basically part of the, Australian military, to have Australian military on the ground. Some do. I mean, this is, I've seen it quite often, variations on this theme. I mean, these are post-colonial countries. There's no way they want to do that. And ultimately, if Australia can't particularly consistently defend itself from Chinese political warfare, why do we even think they'll do it effectively in the Pacific Islands? And if Pacific Islanders in Australia and New Zealand says the same thing and doesn't do great either, have higher rates of poverty, education, things like that, why do we think that Australian systems particularly understand the needs of Pacific Islanders either? Especially better than Pacific Islanders themselves. Doesn't make any sense. So you need to, again, as with the family, you can be tied together, but you make independent decisions, and you trust people that you don't have a choice. You have to let people make independent decisions, and then create an environment where there's enough social capital, trust, goodwill, joint values, that you work together without it being a compulsion, which is where the real problems start to come in, especially in this kind of integrated model that Australia and New Zealand have been pushing in the region.
I guess this is the Chinese Communist Party's greatest fear, that they desperately want to be the main power in the Asia Pacific. But with India, if India becomes the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific, that's like their biggest nightmare.
Yeah, there are a few countries that are existential threats to the rationale of the Chinese Communist Party. Taiwan and the US, obviously, but India also, because the other logic that was presented by the Chinese Communist Party for its existence is that only this sort of a structure can govern a billion people. And they have a country next door that has now a bigger population than they do. And if it also manages to deliver economically and in terms of quality of life and security, then what's the rationale for the existence of the Chinese Communist Party?
Cleo, I'm wondering what you said earlier about giving up on a country as saying like the Solomons are lost to China, etc. How would you look at the case of the Philippines? Because I think you could have said 2 years ago that essentially the Philippines are lost to China. What do you think made the change there? Is it something we could learn from? Did they do it themselves? Did the U.S. help at all? What's the situation? Is there some kind of lesson there for other countries that are facing the same thing?
So I don't know. Apart from the fact they had an election and they got in a new guy who had a different point of view, and I remember when you remember also undoubtedly when he came in, there were a lot of questions based on how the U.S. had dealt with his parents. Whether or not how he would feel about the Americans, but there are a lot of countries that are shifting to a kind of post reflexive anti-American imperialism position, where they're saying, the U.S. did a lot of lousy things, and it might still do lousy things, but it's less lousy than our alternative. And in the meantime, even during the Duterte time, there was groundwork being laid on the American side, for example, around the resurrection of basing, that made it so that if there was a change in government that was more willing to look after the interests of the Philippines as a nation, and they saw as part of that American support being useful, those bases could come back into play very quickly. So there wasn't a total abandonment of Philippines. There was a continual engagement, and a lot of it gets done in areas you don't really see. Commercial engagement, small units, captains and majors level. This is something Colonel Grant Newsham, has also been on the show, talks about the importance of just the presence of the right people on the ground and keeping those relationships alive, and showing that there are all sorts of Americans, just like there are all sorts of Filipinos and there are all sorts of Indians, and you just find the ones that that get along better with your family, and you work with them and you build up from there. So I think in the case of the Philippines, the Filipino people voted in who they voted in for their own reasons. But the groundwork was there so that if he was to make a decision to that in the best interest of the Filipinos, regardless of the history with the U.S., which has been not great over long periods, the relationship with the U.S. now was what helps his country. The U.S. was ready to engage. I don't know how many other countries that's happening in. I just don't know. But the Philippines was a real success for those people who quietly kept that relationship alive for a very long time on both sides, in the knowledge that both countries needed to work. For Philippines, it's issue of its own country being eaten by this, by the dashes of the crocodile. And in the case of the U.S., I mean, we've known this for over 140 years. I mean, how strategic it is, but also it is an essential component of that first island chain. So they did it, but the Chinese haven't gone away. Chinese Communist Party infiltrators haven't gone away in Philippines, and that's the thing. These like a family. You have to, keep going to the family reunions and check in and make sure that everybody's still okay.
Well, since we were talking about the Solomon Islands, many people watching may remember Daniel Soidani, the former premier of Solomon Islands, Malaita province, who essentially got purged by the corrupt pro-Beijing prime minister we were talking about because he didn't want to go along with being pro-Beijing. We helped him raise funds to fly to D.C. to talk to Congress, and he's now back in the Solomon Islands. Can Can you give us the latest?
Yes. Thank you to China Uncensored, China Unscripted Nation for making that possible. He, while he was in D.C., he testified before the Congressional Executive Committee on China, Commission on China. He spoke to members of Congress. He spoke at think tanks, and he really helped people understand what was going on the ground. And he then went to Canada, where he spoke to members of Parliament there, and then he was in Australia, where he did some more think tank engagement. And he just recently went back home after 6 months on the road, 6 months away from his family. I mentioned I was in Solomons recently, and there at the same time as the U.S. congressional delegation was there. And the two members of Congress who were on that delegation, Congressman Dr. Neil Dunn and Congressman Amata Radewagen, were two of the members of Congress who had met with him and who had also, I don't know if you remember this, but his initial visa application to the U.S. was denied. And then Congress wrote letters asking, why have you denied a visa to this man who may be the first person in the democratic world to have had his seat taken away by the federal government for not recognizing the One China policy, or China's version of the One China policy? So they went to Solomons and they met his family, and the family of Celsus Telefilu, who I think you've also interviewed, who's an expert, political expert on Solomons, who's traveling with him. You know, it was really hard to meet his family because they are just wonderful people, and they haven't seen their dad in months and months. And they know what he's doing is important, but they really missed him. And as much as they missed him, I think he missed them even more. And so he finally went home. And I think it was really, and there was a lot of concern about whether he'd be arrested at the airport or not. And he was greeted at the airport with traditional greeting with dancers and singers and you know, a lot of friends, and no arrests. But we're keeping a very close eye on this because it is a persistent threat, and there may be elections coming up. Legally, there's supposed to be elections coming up, which is one of the reasons why they went back. And we're starting to see very kind of odd activity. Like they're in the phase now of having to register to vote, and you have to go back to your village to vote. As Solomons is big, and it consists of a lot of islands. This is the site of the Battle of Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound, Tulagi, and some politicians seem to have enough money to charter entire boats to bring their supporters back to the villages to register them, whereas some who may not have that kind of funding don't. So we're seeing these little playing of elements of the political system already, and if there is an election, we're months and months away. That involve unusual funding sources. But he's gone back, and I know he's very grateful for all you've done. And it, I think, was a lifeline for people who are fighting for democracy in Solomons.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear. It would be amazing if he could be elected prime minister.
I think so. I think he's always been just a local guy. He was elementary school teacher, elementary school principal, and he just wants to serve mostly his local community. You know, so when we've been talking about this, but you know, the thing that he wants is, you know, like health center for his people. Like the demands are so minimal. What they want is so basic. And he doesn't want to be the prime minister of the country. He doesn't want, grand. He just wants his people to be okay. And there are a lot of people like that all over. Personally, I think Celsus Telefilu, who you had on the show, is likely to run at the national level. And he has worked at the prime minister in the PMO, and I think he's more interested in national level politics. But there are so many good people who are fighting very, very big fights, but for their community. And that's for their families, back to family again, and their view of extended family. And that's something that the Chinese Communist Party just is kryptonite. It's kryptonite to them, just like faith is. There's the three things. There's faith, family, and freedom. All of them undermine the operational rationale of the Chinese Communist Party, and all of them are, going back to India, are fine in India, a country that is now bigger than China in terms of population. But even in the villages of Solomon Islands, that's what people are willing to fight for. So as these communities that value faith, family, and freedom find each other through things like the G20, but also just through more of these bilateral engagements, like you see with India going to the Pacific Islands or the Philippines going to a military conference talking about what they're doing, you might start to get this kind of ground level knitting together of resilience that can be bolstered by the bigger powers like the US. Definitely would be helpful. I think they're going to just try to do it on their own regardless. So that was. I'm particularly optimistic this week because the G20 went so well. But if we have the same conversation in another week, it might be a little bit different. We can talk about Canada.
Well, yeah, that's definitely.
Sorry.
I think we're probably out of time to talk about Canada. We'll just say it's bad. But yeah, I think the message I'm going to walk away with this is it's very optimistic. No country or people are truly lost to the evils of communism. Not even the people of China itself. There's plenty of people in mainland China who also want to be rid of that, fundamentally anti-human authoritarian force. And all it takes is the right people in the right positions standing up, doing what's right, and promoting these traditional values, faith, family, freedom. That's all it takes. It can be won. Canada's lost.
I just have to mention that, we have a prime minister that is not very popular at the moment in India. In fact, it's been more than just a moment. And his plane broke down when he tried to leave the G20. So he got stuck in India for an extra 2 days. There's a question about, just who benefits from Canada's plane breaking down and keeping our prime minister stuck in India for an extra 2 days. So if you want to play the fun conspiracy theory game, I'll leave you with that, and you can put it in the comments. Why did Trudeau's plane break down in India?
Must have been the gremlins. Gremlins are very tiny and short. Cleo, how tall are you?
I don't have the technical capability to sabotage a plane.
How hard can it be? You take a hammer and you hit things. Well, thank you for joining us, Cleo. I hope nobody in Canada takes this seriously and you find yourself on trial along with the trucker protesters.
I feel the same way, and do go check out that trial. It's, if you want a little idea of the dystopian legal future, go take a look. But it's hard to find. It's really not being covered. I mean, our Canadian media, the CBC, when the plane broke down, Trudeau's plane broke down, the CBC's headline on that topic was, and I kid you not, along the lines of, Trudeau's not the first prime minister whose plane broke down. Louis Saint Laurent's plane broke down in 1951 in Iceland. That's how far the Canadian media is willing to go to cover over inconvenient stories.
State-run media. Lovely. All right. Well, actually, this is nice to have you on when you're in an optimistic mood. Let us know when you're feeling not optimistic, and then we'll really have a good podcast. And thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Sally Zhang.
And I have a mustache.
See you next time.